The use case we're going to do is a carryover from last month. So if you do recall, last month we worked with Bobby Garzikowski at Outfront, and we looked at a fashion brand. This was a kind of a made-up brand, but mimicking kind of what might happen in real life. And for this use case, we want to focus in a different part of that. So Enza's here to give us an agency perspective on that. And a lot of times when we've done these use cases, we've looked at that area of, okay, I've RFP'd this out and I've gotten all these units back, and how do I sift through that and how do I make my decisions? We wanted to go back even a little further with this use case, and how do we get from that client briefing to an RFP that's going to allow Enza and her team to really look at the units and be more efficient and make sure that the communication flow is kind of really when it needs to be for, to make sure everybody is on the same page with what's coming back and what's going out. So that's where a lot of the conversation will be around today as well. And so just to refresh, the brand is Maza. They're a new luxury fashion brand, high-end fashion, trying to establish themselves in New York City, again, one of the top fashion markets across the globe. So they want to introduce themselves here to the US market. And they compete with fashion brands like Gucci and Prada, other competitive Italian brands, so to speak. And they're trying to reach that young, trendy urbanite. So I'm going to pause here, and I just want to ask Enza, this was our example of a client brief. And, is this sometimes the extent to what you get from a client, or maybe even a new client like this,
Yeah, I mean, in most cases, if we get this is actually a lot. So it's a lot of information.
Really?
Yeah, sometimes we don't even get things like, competes with specific brands. We might get things where it's, we're reaching young, trendy urbanites, but understanding competitive sets were really important. So if we don't get that level of information, we'll ask for it, because it's a really great way to understand, just level set what it is that we're up against and try to understand an audience perspective. In some cases, we actually get even more information where they might give us segmentation studies that they've done, where they may have really specific characteristics that they're giving us. And they may say, somebody that spends X amount of money per month, or or are willing to spend on high fashion brands. So it really does vary by client. The more information we have, the better decisions that we can make in terms of defining the audience. So it's really critical that we at least start with something like this and then go on to try to discover more.
Okay, so this is not this feels kind of
real. Yeah, it was good. When
you
you guys did this last month, I was like, this is great. I mean, like I said, I wish we would get at least this as a basis from everybody.
Okay, and so then what's next for you? I know you started to talk about that a little bit, but this was an example of some secondary research we had done in the last use case. Is this realistic?
It's very realistic. Again, I think if the buyers out there and the planners out there have the time to do this, this is a great way to try to understand an audience and really get to characteristics versus just trying to look at a demographic. When we say young, hip, trendy urbanites, what are we thinking of? Okay, so it's going to be adults, maybe 21 to 34, because we want a higher household income, but there's so much more beyond those demographics. So sometimes doing a little bit of homework like this can really give you the psychographic pieces that will enhance who that audience might be. And really looking at it from the standpoint of what's the behavior that we're looking for, what's their life stage, what's the psychographics behind their purchase patterns that can make the most sense. So yes, doing homework like this would be phenomenal if we have the time. Like I said, in some instances, some clients actually give us this. Yeah, they provide it, and then you're golden. The trick is really trying to then translate it over to what's available to us in in the insight suites, right? So if we have all of this, what do we have available that makes the most sense?
Okay, so that's what you're doing. So you're getting this, you got that high level client brief, maybe been able to do some secondary research, you kind of know who their target is, and so then you come into the insight suite, so to speak, or whatever that you're accessing through the API. And the last use case, we kind of landed on this young digerati. So what happens next? Let's say you find this audience out and seems great. do you just run with that, or what happens?
Well, no, if the ideal scenario again would be, finding this Prism Premier structure already done was really, again, great idea, wonderful. It works out really well because when you look at the definition of young digerati, it fits with what we were looking at, on those earlier pages. But I would always run this by the client, and I would run it by the planning teams with the general agencies to make sure that this fits with what they're thinking their audience is and what they're planning the other media against. So I would run this by them. The other thing I might want to do is, that there are other single characteristics within Insight Suite that's not a Prism Premier that might make sense, right? So there's some statements in there about, I care about, high quality fashion versus price. That might offer up something that's interesting. So a lot of times what I'll do is I will work with the general planning team or the research team at the client to say, these are the potential audiences that make the most sense to me based on what you've given me. I think that the Prism Premier segment 4 makes the most sense, but here are some other alternatives. Do we want to look at those? Do we prefer to only look at this one? So in some cases, we might actually look at multiple audiences at the same time, or we might just go and choose this one. They said this one fit perfectly from the description, so it made sense.
So is this an early step? Like, are there multiple things happening at the same time, or is it like we need to get our audience set first before we can even go forward?
Great question. I would love to be able to tell you that it's a very linear, and it's not. There's definitely other things going on. A lot of times while while our team is looking to pull in the target audience and looking at what's available, we're probably running things already behind the ones that we think make the most sense. But ultimately, before we send the RFP out, ideally we'll have the client buy in on the audience. Yes. Yes. That otherwise we're just going to be spinning wheels.
Gotcha. And so that leads to kind of this actually good segue into the next part of this use case where we're in that strategic planning phase. And, this is, if you joined last month, is, this kind of the guts, so to speak, of those beginning stages of a brief or a RFP development. And, just again, to revisit clients' high-end fashion brand, the Maza. But one of the key things that I've underlined here is this idea of like, I want high impact placements. I want to create big awareness. Like, again, one that seems pretty it doesn't seem unusual.
It's a very common.
But it's very vague. Like, what do you do with that?
I'm sure all the media operators out there are cringing because I can't tell you how many RFPs you've probably gotten just in the past couple of days, asking for things like that. And I think that the trick of this is, high impact actually does have some meaning. It's not as vague as you think it is when it comes to the fashion industry, right? So knowing what the competitors are doing and knowing what fashion brands look for, high impact generally means they like to look at big units. They like to look at them in specific areas of the market where they think this type of audience might be located. I think it's important for us to build out and give better direction to our partners out there. So that's why having the formats where we say things that aren't digital bulletins and that we want walls and murals can make a lot of sense because it'll help focus it. Because otherwise, what's high impact for me may not necessarily be the same thing, for one of the operators. But you have to put it in the perspective of the client. So when you're looking at a fashion brand, I know that some of you guys out there that might have some phenomenal digital screens may think that they're high impact. They're great. But for this fashion brand, we have to think about what that really means for them. So I think it's on us to give that direction of the type of formats that actually might actually represent.
Okay. Cool.
And I think that the other thing that's really important on here is that when we define an audience, so if I'm pulling something from the Insight Suite, whether it's the Prism segment or whether it is the high fashion, high quality, don't care about price scenario, it's really important for us to let our partners, our media partners know what that audience is, because how else are they then going to evaluate anything? And I sometimes wonder how much of that is actually happening out there. We sometimes forget to give them like, look, we're going to be running numbers against this audience. Right. So when you're evaluating your packages that you're sending over, do it against this audience.
Right. And that's a good point. And, one of the things when we were developing the best practices document that hopefully many of you have downloaded and been able to look at, but that was one of the key things that I'm thinking about. Like, we have 8,000 audiences and we're great and we celebrate that, but it also creates the need to be
Very specific.
very specific about what you want so that you get what you want back. Right. So cool. Great point. And so then as we were developing this together, we talked about, this point about, New York, but even still, you want to explore, you're going to explore the market first before moving on. And
right.
kind of what does that mean for you when you're doing this?
I mean, there's a lot of different things that we're going to play around with, and it kind of goes back to an earlier question that you asked in terms of what's happening simultaneously. It's we're getting, approval on our audiences. What we're doing is we're going in and understanding the makeup of the market. Now, New York, I'm based in New York, so I know it pretty well. But my first step is still to go back into the system to understand who are the operators, what do they have in the marketplace, what am I looking at, what kind of areas might make the most sense for this audience, and understanding that becomes, I think, the most critical piece, so that again I can give better direction to our partners, so when they come back to us, we're not just all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so looking at this one is the example, looking at target impressions. And so,
yeah, I think, one of the things that we really wanted to look at it, last month when the webinar was given, it was given from the perspective of a media operator. So now we just want to do a level set here and show you guys. So this is what, Bobby took a look at to say, okay, if we were looking at the top 25 out front units that were doing really well based on target audience impressions against this audience, where would they be located? Mm-hmm. So I would look at it a little bit differently, because obviously I'm going to be looking at it more from the perspective of what operators give me a good swath of impressions against this audience. So,
and you might be getting this, you would get multiple versions of this.
Yeah,
right?
I could get this from Bobby, from Out Front, and
from,
I could get it from Clear Channel or from Interstate, and any, the smaller operators that are in there. I could get this from everybody, whoever I'm going to be RFPing. So this is valid from the from the operator standpoint, but from my standpoint, I need to look at it a little bit broader. So what I would do is I would go in, if I'm looking at it based on target impressions, and this is a whole separate conversations on how you should look at it. But if we're looking at it based on target impressions, I'm not just going to look at the top 25, because a lot of times that really limits what you're going to get back. So I'll look at the filter. Actually, the largest filter that's available to us is, I believe, the top 100. So when I look at it across multiple operators, where are the top 100 units based on target audience impressions for this young Digerati? And you can see it's a little different. It's very different than what was coming up when I was just looking at a single operator. So I'm starting to see units on the New Jersey Turnpike, that wasn't in there before. You're seeing things in downtown Manhattan. You're seeing things in Brooklyn. You're seeing things in Long Island City, and even out in Queens, a little bit closer to, I think that's like right by the airport, or on one of those, So, you're starting to see units that are popping up that are very different than what was on that, the prior one, because now we're opening it up. Now, again, this is based on target impressions. So the New Jersey Turnpike has a ton of traffic on there. So of course, units like that are going to pop up.
Right.
Okay. When you look at it from a reach perspective, it's a similar story. Again, when we looked at it last month, when you guys did it, you're still kind of concentrated in the main areas of Manhattan. You're looking at, again, it's going to be Times Square. It'll be, Midtown by Penn Station, by Port Authority. You do have some units that are popping up in Brooklyn and Long Island City, but again, it's still pretty concentrated. When I look at it, and I'm looking at it across multiple operators, for this one I actually did top 50, because it got a little crazy actually with the top 100. But when I'm looking at top 50, it's giving me similar patterns to what I was looking at with the impressions, where
and that makes you feel, that kind of
feel
affirms,
good.
right?
Well, it affirms a couple of things, right? It's going to affirm, again, my knowledge of the market is, if I want a high fashion brand to have impact in the New York market, most people will focus on Manhattan only. Right, Manhattan, and downtown Manhattan. That's pretty much the way that we look at things. But this gives me a little bit of license to go back to the client and say, I don't know if you're ever going to look and consider New Jersey Turnpike for a high fashion brand, but if we are truly talking about reach and doing a high reach campaign, we might want to consider pulling in a unit. somewhere along there. It might have to be a really
Well,
special unit.
When you think about, again, knowing the market, you think about Short Hills, the Short Hills Mall,
exactly.
things like that.
Right. So that this becomes, I think, some of the ways that we can talk to our clients to let them know that there's things beyond just the gut feeling and the instinct, and even the perceptions that we have of the market, to go out and look at units that might be a little outside what their comfort zone is.
Right. And I think one thing I want to make a point of too, and I know we did mention this last month, and just in the way we're talking about it now, it's the kind of art and science to it, right? It's that, yes, we are able to provide so much more data than ever before with Geopath Insights, but it's still that local market knowledge. You do have, whether it's New York, whether it's Poughkeepsie or wherever, you bring that level of knowledge, and one shouldn't trump the other, so to speak, right?
No, it's always a combination of the two. The numbers really should help support some of, the way I've always looked at it, and the way that I've tried to teach people in my career is that, you use your knowledge, use your skills to think about what would make the most sense for this client, and then see if the numbers pan out. If they don't, then it's kind of it's a different aha moment, right? It's an aha of like, oh wow, I have to think about this a little bit differently. Or it could be, wow, I was really good, I was really close, and here's what makes the most sense for the project.
Okay.
Now, this one is actually my favorite. I think, if anyone has ever heard me do these webinars before, I really expound on composition quite a bit. It really gives you a very different look at the market, because we're not just talking about large units that have a ton of impressions being built behind it, or a lot of reach because it's in these high traffic areas. When you're talking about composition, you're really talking about audience concentration, right? That's what that word really means, audience concentration. So when you look at it, you get a slightly different skew of the type of units that might make the most sense. So when you guys looked at it last month, within Outfront, you could see again, there's Outfront's inventory tends to fall within these areas, so they popped up. But again, now all of a sudden, look, units down in Brooklyn popped up, which was phenomenal. Like those weren't on those earlier ones when we were looking at reach and when we were looking at impressions. And you even have another one out in Jersey, where again it didn't pop up earlier. But when I look at it again across multiple operators, you really see an even greater story. It's again still concentrated in those areas, but then look again in Brooklyn, look again in Long Island City and other areas of the boroughs, where all of a sudden you're really seeing a lot of units that fall in clusters of where these people are, and operators like UAC or Lure or Alchemy, Colossal pop up because they have a good concentration of that audience with their units. They may not get a ton of impressions as compared to some of the other units, but it's showing you the concentration. Now, for some of the folks out there who don't have access to heat maps or other information on the audience and where they might be, this also gives me a sense of the areas I may want to focus in on. So what I might want to be able to do is, this for me as a starting point would be, it's not necessarily that I want just these units, but I might evaluate it and say, you know what, when I send out my RFP, I'm going to ask for units that are concentrated in 3 to 4 areas off of here. It's going to be downtown Manhattan, which again, I knew, but now I've got the proof. So that my aha moment here is like, dang, good job. But I'm also going to make sure that I do Brooklyn, and not only one area of Brooklyn, there's several places in Brooklyn that might make sense. And then as well as Long Island City. So it gives me some input and gives me some direction to be able to give that back to the media operators to say, here's where I want to focus some of the units. Now I might ask for a combination, right? I might ask for a combination of